All right, we are back and ready to continue our deep dive into circular protocol. So far, we've covered a lot of ground. The multi-chain architecture, the sharding system, even these super cool hypercode smart contracts running on GPUs. But now it's time to really see how this technology can actually be used in the real world, especially when it comes to healthcare.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the most promising applications of circular protocol in healthcare is in managing and securing medical records. Just imagine a world where your entire medical history is stored securely and privately on a blockchain only accessible by people you actually give permission to.
Okay, walk me through this. How would this actually work in practice?
Well, let's say you go to a new doctor. Instead of having to fill out mountains of paperwork or try to remember every single detail of your medical history, you could just grant them access to your blockchain-based record.
Okay.
And they would instantly have all the information they need to give you the best possible care.
Okay, that definitely sounds a lot more efficient. But how would we guarantee privacy? Make sure that only authorized people can actually access those records.
Well, that's where blockchain's inherent security features come in. Every single record would be encrypted and stored on the blockchain, and access would be controlled through cryptographic keys.
Okay.
So you would hold the private key, and you would decide which healthcare providers get access.
So it's like having a digital lockbox for all of your health information, and you get to choose who has the key. I love it. It's a huge improvement over the current system, where it feels like data breaches and privacy violations are just a part of life.
It definitely gives patients a lot more control over their own data. And beyond personal health records, circular protocol could also completely revolutionize clinical trials.
Okay, how so?
Well, picture this. Researchers from all over the world collaborating on a clinical trial. All of the data is stored and tracked on a blockchain.
I mean, that would be a game changer for medical research. No more worries about whether the data is accurate or if someone's trying to manipulate the results. Plus, it would make sharing findings so much faster.
Exactly. It could really accelerate the pace of discovery.
That's incredible.
Mm.
But wouldn't that require a ton of coordination between everyone involved, making sure everyone has the right access and that the participants' privacy is protected?
Well, that's where Circular's multi-chain architecture comes into play again. Remember how we were talking about private and public chains earlier?
Right.
They could have private chains for managing all that sensitive patient data, making sure they're complying with IPO regulations. But at the same time, they can use public chains for sharing findings and collaborating with other researchers.
Gotcha. So it's about finding that balance between privacy and transparency, depending on what they need to do with the data. It's really clever. Okay, so we've talked about medical records and clinical trials, but what about the pharmaceutical industry? Where does circular protocol fit into all of that?
One major problem in the pharmaceutical industry is counterfeit drugs. It's a huge issue that puts people's lives at risk and just undermines trust in the healthcare system. But with circular protocol, you could actually track pharmaceuticals on a blockchain at every step of the supply chain, from manufacturing to distribution to the pharmacy.
So every single medication would have a unique digital ID stored on the blockchain, kind of like a fingerprint.
Yeah.
And by scanning that ID, anyone could instantly verify that the medication is authentic.
Exactly. It would make it way harder for counterfeit drugs to slip through the cracks, which would protect patients and help ensure the integrity of the whole pharmaceutical supply chain.
Wow, that's a huge step forward.
Yeah.
Now, what about the whole education and credential verification thing that we touched on earlier? Using blockchain to store things like diplomas and medical licenses so it's easy to verify someone's qualifications.
Absolutely. No more worrying about fake degrees or people misrepresenting their credentials. Employers and institutions could instantly verify any certificate or license that's stored on the circular blockchain.
I like that.
Yeah.
You would make the whole process so much more efficient and transparent. It seems like circular protocol is really addressing those key issues of trust, transparency, and efficiency in healthcare. But let's shift gears for a second and talk about the circular ecosystem as a whole. What about their native token, CIRX? What role does that play in all of this?
CIRX is the fuel that powers the whole circular ecosystem. It's used for everything from transaction fees to node rewards to governance voting.
So let's say I'm a doctor and I want to store my patient's records on circular protocol. I would use CIRX tokens to pay for those transactions.
Exactly. And the nodes that help maintain the network and process those transactions, they get rewarded with CIRX tokens.
Okay, so the more activity there is on the network, the more valuable those CRX tokens become.
Yeah.
Interesting. But what about the token itself? Tell me a little bit about the tokenomics, the nitty-gritty details.
Sure. So CRX has a fixed total supply of 1 trillion tokens, and a portion of those will be sold during a public sale. Other portions are reserved for things like liquidity pools, the team early investors, a grant program for developers, and marketing efforts.
Okay, so they've got a pretty clear plan for distribution. What about trading, though? Will people be able to buy and sell CRX on exchanges?
The plan is to list CRX on some major exchanges by the end of Q1 2024. But of course, that depends on fundraising and regulatory compliance.
Right, of course. There are always hurdles to clear. All right, so let's move on to the future of circular protocol. We got a roadmap for development, right? What are some of the key milestones they're working towards?
They've already accomplished a lot. All of Circular's core features are fully developed, and it's actually a working blockchain platform right now.
Wow, that's impressive. But I know there are a few things that are still in development, like the hypercode compiler and the performance balancer. When can we expect to see those go live?
They're aiming to release the hypercode interpreter in February of 2025, which is the first step towards their full smart contract vision.
So we're not that far off from seeing hypercode in action. That's exciting. And what about the performance balancer? When will that AI-powered optimization be unleashed on the network?
They're targeting May 2025 for the performance balancer. Right now, they're busy collecting real-world data from the network to train the AI model.
So it's all about gathering as much information as possible before they unleash it on the world.
Exactly. And once the performance balancer is up and running, we should see some serious improvements in efficiency and stability across the network.
That's awesome. And after the performance balancer, what's next on the agenda?
Well, in July 2025, they're planning to release the hypercode compiler, which will really unlock the full potential of hypercode for parallel processing.
Okay, so July 2025, that's when we can really expect to see those complex applications take off.
Yeah.
And what comes after that?
Well, then we have the highly anticipated launch of Hyperblock in August 2025. Remember, that's the visual editor that lets you build smart contracts without actually writing any code.
Oh yeah, that's going to be a game changer. I can already picture doctors designing their own healthcare apps, researchers automating data analysis. The possibilities are endless.
For sure. And then to wrap up their roadmap, they're planning to release full GPU support for hypercode in October 2025.
Okay, so October 2025 is when things could really get wild. We're talking about massive computational power complex simulations, the whole 9 yards. It's an ambitious roadmap, but they seem to have a clear vision for the future. So how are they planning on getting more people to actually use circular protocol, especially in healthcare?
Well, they're going to start with a controlled launch involving around 55 nodes, mostly owned by Circular themselves. But as the transaction volume increases, they'll launch a node recruitment program to encourage more people to participate.
So they're starting small and then scaling up as they go. Makes sense. So who can participate in this node recruitment program? Do you need some kind of supercomputer to run a circular node?
Nope, not at all. One of the coolest things about Circular is how accessible it is. Their node architecture doesn't require any specialized hardware.
So anyone with a decent computer could potentially become part of the circular network. That's awesome.
Yep, and to make sure the onboarding process is smooth, they'll have a benchmarking utility built into the node software to assess eligibility.
Okay.
Plus, all the nodes will be remotely configured by the performance balancer, so everything runs as smoothly as possible.
Nice. So they've made it pretty straightforward to get involved. But what about incentives? You know what's in it for someone who decides to run a circular node.
There are two main ways nodes get rewarded on Circular transaction fees and block rewards.
All right, let's start with transaction fees. How does that work?
There are a few different types of transaction fees. So first you have an entry fee, which is paid to the network access gateways for essentially letting the transaction into the network. Then you have broadcast fees. Those are paid to the first node that receives and propagates a transaction.
Okay, so those first two fees are about rewarding nodes for keeping the network running smoothly and processing those transactions efficiently. What else is there?
Then there's the priority fee, which is optional. Users can choose to pay this fee to speed up the execution of their transaction.
So if I'm in a hurry and I need something processed quickly, I can just pay a little extra to jump to the front of the line. Makes sense. What about the last fee?
Right. Lastly, there's an execution fee for running hypercode smart contracts.
Gotcha. So the more complex the transaction, the higher the fee. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So that covers the transaction fees. What about the block rewards?
Block rewards are given to nodes for successfully mining new blocks. It's how new CIRX tokens are created and put into circulation.
Okay. So it's a combination of fees for handling transactions and rewards for contributing to the security and growth of the whole blockchain. It's a pretty solid system. Yeah. But what about the cost of these transaction fees? Are we talking about crazy high prices that would make using Circular super expensive?
Not at all. Circular is really focused on keeping those transaction fees affordable. They're aiming for somewhere between 0.00001 and 0.4035, depending on the complexity of the transaction.
Wow, that's incredibly reasonable, especially compared to some of the other blockchain platforms out there. Okay, so we've talked about financial incentives, but I know that Circular also emphasizes this concept of reputation. We touched on it briefly before, but can you go into a little more detail about how reputation actually works in their ecosystem?
Sure, reputation is at the core of their proof of reputation consensus mechanism. The better a node behaves and the more consistently it contributes to the network, the higher its reputation score will climb.
So it's not just about the money, it's about earning respect within the Circular community. That's really cool. And what are the benefits of having a good reputation?
Nodes with higher reputation scores get certain perks within the Circular ecosystem, things like increased voting power in governance decisions, priority access to new features, even discounts on transaction fees.
It sounds like they're building a really strong community with this reputation system. It encourages people to be good actors and creates a more sustainable ecosystem overall.
All right, I think we've covered a ton of information here, from the technical details of Circular Protocol to its potential use cases in healthcare and the whole tokenomics of CIRX. I think we're ready to wrap things up with some final thoughts and key takeaways.